in your lives in very special ways. And we are grateful for all the blessings of life that He has given to us and the opportunities that He gives to us to proclaim the name of Jesus to a lost and dying world. And so I hope and pray that you have seen God at work in your life this week. Let me give you a couple announcements here real quick. One, don't forget ladies. The ladies conference starts tomorrow. And that is kind of, are y'all meeting here to kind of carpool? What time? Okay, 3:30, 4 o'clock. So we'll be here about. Okay, so you want them here by 3:30? Okay. Okay, and you'll be coming back each night, so just be aware of that. So be here by 3:30 tomorrow, and that is tomorrow. Then Friday all day, and then right. So you'll be up there all day on Friday, and then Saturday till about noon, right? 1 o'clock, 2, yeah. So. Yeah. So anyway, just be aware of that. And then, let's see, we have a men's prayer breakfast, not this Saturday, a week from this coming Saturday. So don't forget about that as well. We have our missions conference coming up on the 29th. And so that starts March 29th through April the 1st. And we'll have combined Sunday school that Sunday morning here in the auditorium, junior high and up. And then we'll have worship hour. And then 5 o'clock will be our international dinner. 6 o'clock we'll have one of the missionaries speak to us. I think it's Brother Ephraim Collier. They'll be speaking to us, planning a church in New Braunfels. And they're looking at basically this time next year to have their first launch. And so between now and then, we'll be putting together some teams. Just be praying about to go down and pass out flyers and things like that, announcing the start of the church and doing some canvassing in neighborhoods and stuff like that. And so we can go down and help with that. And so be in prayer. Good opportunity for service there. And but he'll probably be speaking to us that Sunday night. And then Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday night, 7 o'clock. And so just be in prayer for that. Be in prayer for our missionaries as they travel. Be in prayer for each and every service. Be in prayer for what God would have you do for the cause of Faith Promise Missions for 2026. And we are so grateful for all that God has enabled us to do in the last several years. And we want to keep that momentum, and we want to keep building the kingdom. And this is one of the greatest ways that we can do it in the cause of worldwide evangelism. Then the following Sunday is Easter. We'll be giving out the Faith Promise cards that Sunday on the 29th, and then we'll be collecting them on Easter Sunday. And so just be praying over them and pray about it now, even now. Easter is April the 5th, and then Lord's Supper that evening as well. And then there's a ladies' shopping trip on April the 18th. So where is that going? Oh, that's right. Not Bass Pro. No, okay. You could kind of go a roundabout way in Fredericksburg. But also don't forget, April 11th is our yard sale. And it's from 7 a.m. to noon. If you have items to donate, see Brother Dakota, and he'll get you hooked up there where to put it. And all the funds from that will go to our missions team going to Guatemala at the end of May. And so be in prayer for them as well. I think that is everything. Appreciate everybody that participated in the luncheon Sunday. That was a great success. I think raised almost $1,000. And so we are grateful for that. And it is a blessing to our missions trip team, our team going to be able to help offset some of that cost. And so, like I said, appreciate your help. And then, if you've got anything you want to get rid of at the house, see Brother Dakota. In fairly good shape. Yep. Spouse doesn't count. Right. Yep. Nope. Can't do that. Yeah. All right. I think that's everything. Did I forget anything? Seems like I'm forgetting something, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. All right. We are finishing up tonight the attributes of God, not the attributes of God, but the attribute of God's omnipotence tonight. We'll finish that up tonight. And next week, we'll start the third division of intransitive attributes, and we'll be talking about the attributes of God having in relationship to moral beings. In other words, in relationship to his creatures. Right now, with omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, we're dealing with God's attributes in relation to his creation as a whole. In other words, these attributes are expressed within the universe that he created. He's omniscient in the universe. He's omnipresent in the universe. He is omnipotent in the universe. It's in his creation of the universe that these three attributes are expressed. They were always there, but they have to have an object of expression, and that object of expression had to be creation. And so the next division we're going into, the third division, are attributes having the first division in transitive attributes, if you remember, was the attributes relating to time and space. That was his immensity and his eternality. Eternality in relationship to time, immensity in relationship with space. The second category was the one that we're finishing up tonight in relationship to his creation. The third is in relationship, meaning material world, material creation, the universe. The next category that we're going into are the attributes as they relate to us as moral beings. Give you an example. We'll be looking at first veracity and faithfulness, or transitive truth. How truth, God's truth, relates to us as his creatures, and it relates to us in the aspect of veracity and faithfulness, and we'll be talking about those next week. Is what we'll get into. And so, just to kind of give you a heads up, right now we're talking about omnipotence. We're talking about God's omnipotence, and when we talk about God's omnipotence, we're talking about the fact that this refers to God's ability to accomplish all things that fall within the scope of power, whether achieved through means or independently of them. So whether or not he uses us, he uses some other means in creation, or he just acts independent of his creation and accomplishes that task, whatever it may be. There are three things that we're going to be kind of looking at tonight as far as God's omnipotence and what it does or does not imply. The first thing we're going to look at is the fact that omnipotence, God's omnipotence, does not imply power to do that which is not an object of power. That is another way of saying it is not to say that God can do anything. Okay? That we've talked about this at the very beginning of talking about God's omnipotence. It is not that God can do anything, because there are plenty of things that God cannot or will not do. And so they are not the object of power. He cannot do that which is self-contradictory or contradictory to the nature of God. He cannot act in a way that is in contradiction to his perfect, loving, holy, righteous will. He cannot act contrary to that. To act contrary to that, he would cease to be God. He would no longer be God. It would be like us when we, have you ever said to yourself, why in the world did I do that? Why in the world did I say that? That never happens with God. God always acts in a way that is consistent with his being. And he never acts in contradiction to his being. And so when we say that God is omnipotent, we are not saying that he can do anything. He cannot do that which is self-contradictory or contradictory to his nature as God. In other words, God has all the power that is consistent with infinite perfection. He always acts to maintain and in accordance with infinite perfection. Has all power to do what is worthy of himself. That's one of the reasons why when we talk about, and we'll get to this a little later, so I won't go there now, but that's why we say that God keeps his word. Because if God failed to keep his word, then God would fail to be infinitely perfect, whole, complete, not lacking anything at any point in time. And I will say this to you. I've been watching some videos. I'm still looking through what we're going to do. I pretty much got it laid out, I think. But I've been watching videos today on Israel, and I was watching one in particular on the Palestinian people, and it's by Jimmy DeYoung, and it's on Esau and the Palestinians. The Palestinians are descendants of Esau. They're his offspring. And just so you know, right, God prophesied that they would be at war until Jesus came back. That there's never going to be a time when the offspring of Jacob and the offspring of Esau are not going to be at war. And that's going to be that way until Jesus returns. So keep that in mind as you watch the news. But it struck me again, the satanic desire to destroy the Jewish people. Because if Satan can destroy the Jewish people, then he can destroy the throne of David, which means he could remove the possibility of the return of Christ. Because that is why Jesus is coming back, to take his seat on the throne of David. And that's why Satan hates the Jews, because he understands if he can wipe them out, God would cease to be God. And God's program would fail, which means then that God would cease to be God. And so as you see all of the things going on in the world, especially as they relate to Israel and the hatred that is building in this country for Israel, realize that it is satanic in nature. Its source is in Satan. It is in this world, in this flesh, because it is a satanic it is a satanic effort to destroy God's authority and perfection, because he knows if he can do that, he can destroy God. God would cease to be God. But the Bible tells us that God has all the power necessary that is consistent with infinite perfection, which means we can rest assured, and he has shown that power down through history in the fulfillment of prophecy, that he is going to fulfill all prophecy, because he's fulfilled all the prophecy up until this point. And if he's fulfilled all the prophecy up until this point, it is an assurance that he's going to fulfill all the prophecy that comes hereafter. And so we can rest in it. We can trust it. And so he has all power that is worthy of himself. God cannot make wrong to be right. In other words, when we say that God is, let me go back one second, Terry, and then you can take a picture. when we say that God has all the power that is consistent with infinite perfection, all the power to do that which is worthy of himself, it means that God cannot make wrong to be right. Because to make wrong right would be to do something that is contrary to his perfection. To make a wrong, something that is wrong, something that is sinful, to be holy, would be a denial of himself. Because that which is holy because it is consistent with the character and nature of God. That which is sinful because it is contrary to the character and nature of God. So God cannot make hatred of himself. God cannot bless someone who hates him. Or he cannot make hatred of himself a blessed thing. Put it that way. It is because it would be contrary to his very nature to do so. And so the hatred of God rests under the judgment of God, because that is consistent with the nature of God and the character of God. And so it is important for us to understand that truth. The fact that, let me go back to number one, omnipotence does not imply power to do that which is not an object of power. It does not imply that God can do something that's contrary to his perfection or his nature or his character. Number two, omnipotence does not imply the exercise of all his power on the part of God. The fact that God is omnipotent does not mean that at all times God is using all his power in every circumstance. It doesn't mean that in everything that God does, he exercises all of his power. In other words, another way of putting it, God has power over his power. He has the ability to control the display of his power. It is not just on full display at all times. In other words, one of the things we'll be doing throughout eternity is learning about the power of God, because we have never seen and never will see the absolute display of his power, because his power is infinite. So when God displays power, no matter how mighty that power, even in the creation of the universe, God did not use all of his power, because his power is infinite. And remember when we had the question that I asked you before, if you have column A and column B, column A is infinite, column B is infinite, and you add the largest imaginable number, or you subtract the largest imaginable number that you can imagine from column A, which column would be bigger? The answer is they'd both be the same. Because it doesn't matter. If they're infinite, it doesn't matter. You can take out of it whatever you want, and it doesn't reduce its infinitude. And so God has power over his power, and his power is never reduced. His power has never been fully and totally exercised. Another way of putting it is God's power is under the control of a wise and holy will. God's power is under the control of a wise and holy will. And God displays his power consistent with his perfection, consistent with all of his other attributes, and consistent with his wise, holy, righteous, loving will. All the time. And there's never a time when his power is not controlled by that wise, holy, loving, righteous will. Number three, omnipotence in God does not exclude, but implies the power of self-limitation. God's omnipotence, or the omnipotence in God does not exclude but implies the power of self-limitation. So, what do we mean by that? Well, one of the things we mean by that is that the human freedom is not rendered impossible by the divine omnipotence, but exists by virtue of it. Why is it that we have freedom? Because God limits the expression of His power in relation to us. And He does so out of love. So our freedom is not rendered impossible by God's divine omnipotence. The fact that He can control every circumstance. In fact, one of the things, and do I want to go here or not? Let me get something real quick so I make sure. It's one of the things that really is more in line with God's foreknowledge, but God's foreknowledge implies God's omnipotence. God's omnipotence implies God's foreknowledge. All of these, God's omnipotence, God's foreknowledge, God's omniscience, and God's omnipresence are all tied together. And you deny one, you weaken the others, if not absolutely deny it. And there's a lot of people that have the argument against God's sovereignty, God's foreknowledge, in the fact that it denies human freedom. It does not deny human freedom. And one of the reasons why it doesn't deny human freedom is because God exercises His will over His power in relation to us, His creature. But there's a fallacy, or there's an argument for fatalism. In other words, the argument for fatalism is, well, if God foreknows it, then that means I have to do it. That means that I have to do what God foreknows. And that doesn't follow the idea of God's foreknowledge. There's three statements that are in the argument for fatalism. Necessarily, if God foreknows, and these are, I'll give you the first two, and then I'll give you the first two premises, and then give you the conclusion of the argument for fatalism. Necessarily, if God foreknows I will do X, then I will do X. Pretty straightforward. If God necessarily, meaning I have to, if God knows I will do X, I will do X. Secondly, God foreknows I will do X. So if God foreknows I will do X, that means I will do X. Second, God knows I'm going to do X. Conclusion, necessarily I will do X. And then I have to do what it is God foreknows that I will do. What's wrong with that premise? And the conclusion. The two premises. Right? If God knows I'm going to do X, and this is all part of God's restraining power over His, according to His will, and Him restraining because He could, in His sovereignty, make sure that you do X. But if God necessarily, in other words, if God knows I'm going to do X, foreknows I'm going to do X, then I will do X. So God foreknows I'm going to do whatever X is, so that means I'm going to do X. The third, the conclusion isn't supported by the first two premises. It is because the third doesn't deny the ability for me to choose something other than X. You understand what I'm saying? So what that means, well, if God foreknows I'm going to do X, then, and God knows I'm going to do, then And God knows I'm going to, if God knows I'm going to do X, then knows I will do X, then I will do X. God foreknows I'm going to do whatever, and that means then when I get down to the actual decision to do X, I have to do X. That's not correct. When you get down to the actual decision to do X, you could do B. But then God's foreknowledge would be different. Then God's foreknowledge would have been, you're going to do B. So his foreknowledge of me doing whatever and making the decision doesn't mean I have to make that decision. It just means that if I in that moment would have chosen to do something other than X, then God's foreknowledge would have been different at the beginning of the equation. You raised your hand. Right. No, you haven't. Actually, we're going to get to that here in a minute, because it is, the reality is that the exercising of God's omnipotence in self-control and controlling himself is one of the greatest expressions of his love. In other words, the ability to deny oneself and to exercise the restraint over your ability in certain circumstances is the very expression of love. One example, God humbling himself and taking on human flesh in the person of Christ was an act of omnipotence. This is, we tend to talk about it in relation to love, and that's correct. But why was it loving? Because God could have chosen not to. He could have chosen to start all over again. He could have chosen to say, I'm going to wipe this planet clean and start again and do it all over again. But he didn't. Instead, he displayed omnipotence in restraining his judgment, restraining his wrath, to control and to act according and to display his omnipotence in relationship, again, to that holy and perfect will. And this has huge implications in our life, because to have somebody who is all powerful but has no self-control, that would be terrifying. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so the fact that God controls his power and exercises his will over his power, over his omnipotence, it should be for us a great foundation for trust. Because he can and does. It was the power, this is talking about Christ, it was the power to retain life. It was the power, and the power was to retain life and to escape suffering with the will to hold it unused, which proved Jesus to be what he was, the obedient and perfect man. Jesus, the song, he could have called 10,000 angels. He had the power to retain his life, because the Bible says he laid it down willingly. He had the power to retain his life. He had the power to escape suffering, and he did not do it. He held it unused. That's omnipotence. That is the display of God's omnipotence, and the expression of God's love for us is that he used his omnipotence in conjunction with his perfect, holy will. And we are most like the omnipotent God when we limit ourselves for love's sake. When we have the option to pursue our own selfish desires, to pursue our own path of ease, to pursue the path of least resistance, and we don't exercise that power for the sake of someone else, we are most like Jesus. Because what is our natural tendency? Our natural tendency is to take the path of least resistance. To do what it pleases ourselves. We see that all the time. Everywhere around us. In our own lives. But it is that reality that is most effective in our life to ground us in trust. In fact, the last slide, the attribute of omnipotence is the ground of trust as well as fear on the part of God's creature. Trust in the fact that we know that God can do whatever He says, whatever He's promised. He has the power to do it according to His will perfectly every time. But it also means that that is true of the blessings and promises of God, but that is also true of the judgments and wrath of God. It goes both ways. He has the power to bless. He has the power to pour out blessing upon us. He has the power to save us. But at the same time, He has the power to judge us if we live contrary to His will. If we reject Christ, if we reject the way of truth, He has the same omnipotent power to accomplish His will in His creation, to bless us and to keep His promises to us, is the same power that is at work in this life, in His creation, to bring about judgment and wrath against sin. Same omnipotent power. And so it has, and it is the ground both of trust and of fear. Because God keeps His word to bless, and God keeps His word to trust. To bless, to judge. And He does so because He is omnipotent. And His omnipotence is at the full disposal of His will to do whatever it is that is in line with His perfection at all times. And like Nebuchadnezzar said, and none can stay in His hand or say unto him, what doest thou? He does according to His will in the army of heaven, in heaven and among the armies of the earth, or however it says there in Daniel 4. But He has the power to do exactly what He desires at all times. And it should produce trust in us that He will keep His word to us. But it ought to also motivate us that He also has the power to chastise His children wherever they be. And He has the power to judge the world in righteousness. That He will, and that He has promised to do one day, and He will carry it out because He has the power to do so. All right, we'll stop there. Anyway, so like I said, next week we'll be talking about the transitive truths of God in relationship to His creatures, His moral beings, to us. And we'll be starting off with veracity and faithfulness, or transitive truth. And that's a good one. You won't want to miss it. I'll just close the book without putting my marker in. There it is. I've been there enough that it opened right up to it. All right. Prayer sheets. Anybody need a prayer sheet? Or David will be passing these out. Is there anybody that needs to add someone? Okay. Brother George wants to add 2 people. Hang on, Brother George. Let me get over here. Who would you like to add? Travis and Jason. This is Brother George. Travis and Jason. Okay. Anybody else? Take off. Okay. Yep. So just leave Ted on. Okay. Anyone else? So Travis and Jason for Brother George. Someone to add. Want to keep these names before the Lord, calling them out before the Lord. God is the salvation belongs to the Lord, and He is still, and we know it's His will to save souls. So we're simply asking Him to do what we know that it is His desire to do, and so we can come boldly before the throne of grace and call these names out before the Lord, knowing full well that God is going to do and accomplish His will in their lives. Anybody else? All right, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Take these names before the Lord.